For more than a century, the world has whispered one chilling phrase that sends shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to speak it. Those who disturb the tombs of Egypt will suffer the curse of the pharaohs. It appears in documentaries that millions watch. It appears in best-selling mystery novels. It appears in thousands of YouTube videos, each one adding another layer to the legend. The story has become so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness that most people accept it as historical fact without question. But here's the truth that very few people ever stop to examine critically. The truth that archaeologists know but the public rarely hears. The truth that will completely dismantle everything you think you know about ancient Egypt. Most of what we believe about the curse of the pharaohs does not match historical evidence. It does not match scientific data. It does not match archaeological records. In fact, when you actually examine the sources, the timeline, and the real circumstances, the entire narrative collapses like a house of cards. In other words, the story we've been told is not the story that actually happened. Today, we're not retelling old legends. We're not repeating myths that have been recycled for 100 years. We're not hunting for ghosts in ancient tombs. We are doing something far more powerful and far more revealing. We're breaking the curse apart piece by piece, using logic, using psychology, using hard science, and using real historical analysis to expose the hidden truth behind one of the world's most enduring mysteries. And what you're about to discover is far more fascinating than the legend itself. Because the real story isn't about supernatural forces reaching across millennia to punish the living. The real story is about how humans create myths, how fear spreads faster than facts, and how a legend born from newspaper sensationalism became accepted as historical truth. Let's begin by examining the very foundation of this curse, because it turns out that foundation is built on nothing but sand. When most people hear about the curse of the pharaohs, they imagine ancient Egyptian priests inscribing dire warnings on tomb walls. They picture hieroglyphs promising death to anyone who dares disturb the eternal rest of the pharaohs. They envision dark spells woven into the very stone of the pyramids, waiting patiently for thousands of years to strike down intruders. But here is something almost no one realizes. Something that should immediately cast doubt on the entire story. The vast majority of royal tombs do not contain curses at all. Not the Great Pyramid of Giza, not the pyramids of Khafra or Menkaure, not the elaborate tombs in the Valley of the Kings, not the great burial chambers of Egypt's most powerful rulers, Ramses, Seti, Thutmose. None of them contain the kind of curse inscriptions that legend would have you believe. So where did this idea come from? If the ancient Egyptians didn't actually leave curses in their tombs, who invented this story and why? The answer is both surprising and, frankly, a little disappointing for those who want to believe in ancient magic. Victorian journalists from the 1800s invented it, not ancient Egyptians. Victorian newspapermen looking to sell copies. Let me explain the context because it's crucial to understanding how this myth was born. During the 19th century, archaeology became the newest form of mass entertainment across Europe. The British Empire and French colonialism had opened Egypt to Western exploration. People in London, Paris, and New York became obsessed with everything Egyptian. Mummies, pyramids, hieroglyphs, ancient rituals. It was exotic. It was mysterious. It was a culture so old and so distant that it felt almost alien, and publishers quickly discovered something very important about human nature. Mystery sells, fear sells, and anything supernatural, that sells even more. So newspaper writers did what journalists have always done when facts aren't quite dramatic enough. They exaggerated. They took ordinary archaeological accidents, unfortunate coincidences, and natural deaths, and twisted them into tales of curses, omens, and ancient revenge. When an archaeologist fell ill after weeks in the desert heat, curse. When an expedition member died from infection in an era before antibiotics? Curse. When someone involved in an excavation had bad luck years later? Obviously curse. And because people were already fascinated by Egypt, a land that represented mystery, death, and the supernatural in the Western imagination, they believed these stories easily. It required no evidence, no proof, just a good headline, and the public's imagination did the rest. It was the perfect formula for creating a legend that would outlast the truth by a century. But none of this was rooted in actual Egyptian culture or belief. In fact, when you study what ancient Egyptians actually believed, you discover something fundamentally different from the curse narrative. Ancient Egyptians didn't think in terms of curses the way we imagine them today. Their worldview was built on concepts of Ma'at, cosmic balance, and harmony. They believed in protecting the dead, yes. They believed in preserving the body for the afterlife. They believed in maintaining order against the forces of chaos. But supernatural attacks on tomb intruders centuries later? That wasn't part of their theology. When tombs occasionally did contain warnings, they were symbolic deterrents aimed at contemporary tomb robbers, not magical spells designed to kill archaeologists thousands of years in the future. So already, before we even get to the famous stories, the entire foundation of the curse is built on misinterpretation, sensationalism, and Western projection of supernatural beliefs onto a culture that didn't hold them. But if the curse was just Victorian invention and yellow journalism, why did it explode into a global phenomenon that persists to this day? For that, we need to travel to November 1922, to a dusty valley in Egypt, where one discovery would transform archaeological speculation into worldwide hysteria. In November 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter made what many consider the greatest archaeological discovery in history. After years of fruitless searching in the Valley of the Kings, after nearly giving up, after his wealthy patron Lord Carnarvon had almost withdrawn funding, Carter's team uncovered a staircase beneath the sand. That staircase led to a sealed doorway, and behind that doorway lay the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, untouched for more than 3,000 years. The world was absolutely mesmerized. Newspapers from New York to London to Paris covered every detail. The tomb was filled with treasures beyond imagination. Golden furniture, jeweled artifacts, the iconic golden death mask. It was a time capsule from ancient Egypt, perfectly preserved, a window into a world that had been lost to history. But then, just a few months after the tomb's opening, something happened that would overshadow the archaeological significance entirely. Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of the excavation, the wealthy British aristocrat who had funded Carter's search, died unexpectedly in Cairo, and the newspapers exploded. The curse has struck. Ancient dead claim another victim. Pharaoh Tutankhamun takes his revenge from beyond the grave. The story spread across the globe faster than any fact-checking could possibly catch up. It had everything the public craved: mystery, death, ancient Egypt, the supernatural, wealthy aristocrats, revenge from the grave. It was irresistible. Within days, the curse of the pharaohs transformed from Victorian speculation into accepted fact. And from that moment forward, every death, every illness, every misfortune that befell anyone even remotely connected to the tomb was attributed to Tutankhamun's curse. But here's the question that almost no one stops to ask. The question that immediately exposes the fundamental weakness of the entire narrative. Does the actual timeline support the idea of a supernatural curse? Does the evidence hold up when you examine it critically? Let's break it down with cold, hard logic. Lord Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite that became blood poisoning, worsened significantly by his chronic health problems, in a climate his body wasn't accustomed to, during an era when antibiotics didn't exist. This is not mysterious. This is not supernatural. This is basic medical reality in 1923. Carnarvon had been in poor health for years. He had suffered a severe car accident in 1901 that left him with permanent breathing difficulties. He had weak lungs. He was prone to infections. Egypt's heat and unfamiliar bacteria were a dangerous combination for someone in his condition. In fact, his doctor had warned him repeatedly about the risks of traveling to Egypt, but Carnarvon was obsessed with archaeology and ignored medical advice. His death, while tragic, was entirely predictable from a medical standpoint. But here's the part that completely destroys the curse narrative, the fact that should end this discussion immediately, but somehow never does. Howard Carter, the man who physically entered the tomb first, the person most directly involved in disturbing Tutankhamun's rest, the archaeologist who handled the mummy itself, lived for 16 more years after opening the tomb. 16 years. He was the most exposed to whatever supernatural force supposedly existed. He spent more time in the tomb than anyone. He was there first, stayed longest, handled the artifacts most intimately. Yet he lived until 1939, dying at age 64, from entirely natural causes. If a curse existed, if an ancient pharaoh was striking down those who disturbed his rest, why would it spare the primary intruder? Why kill the wealthy backer but not the archaeologist who actually opened the sarcophagus? It makes no sense. Unless, of course, there was no curse at all. Let's look at the other members of the excavation team, because this is where the curse story completely falls apart under scrutiny. Arthur Mace, who helped Carter open the tomb, lived for several more years. His death was attributed to the curse, but he had been suffering from pleurisy for years before the excavation. Harry Burton, the photographer who documented everything inside the tomb, lived until 1940. Alfred Lucas, the chemist who analyzed and preserved the artifacts, lived until 1945. Douglas Derry, the anatomist who examined Tutankhamun's mummy, lived into his 80s. Richard Bethel, Carter's secretary, did die relatively young, but from a completely unrelated heart condition that had nothing to do with tomb exposure. But here's what really exposes the absurdity. Of the 58 people present at the tomb's opening, only 8 died within a dozen years. That's not a curse. That's actually below the normal mortality rate for that demographic in that era. Many expedition members lived into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. One lived into his 90s. So if a supernatural curse was real, if an ancient force was targeting those who disturbed the tomb, why did it have such terrible aim? Why did it skip the most obvious targets? Why did it kill some people immediately but let others live for decades? The answer is devastatingly simple. People remembered the dramatic deaths and completely ignored all the non-dramatic ones. They counted the hits and ignored the misses. They saw patterns where none existed because they desperately wanted to see them. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called confirmation bias. It's our tendency as humans to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting our existing beliefs. When you expect a curse, you interpret normal deaths as proof. When someone dies young, it's the curse. When someone lives to 80, well, you just forget to mention them. This is exactly how myths transform into accepted truth in the public imagination. Not through evidence, but through selective memory and the human love of dramatic stories. But wait, you might be thinking. If there's no supernatural curse, why do some archaeologists and tomb explorers actually get sick? Why are there stories of people falling ill after entering sealed chambers? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because while the supernatural explanation doesn't hold up, there were real dangers inside Egyptian tombs. And these dangers were not magical. They were biological, although the idea of an ancient curse is nonsense. The biological hazards inside sealed tombs are very real, very dangerous, and completely scientific. When a burial chamber stays sealed for thousands of years, when no fresh air circulates, when organic materials slowly decay in darkness, the environment inside becomes a perfect incubator for extremely dangerous microorganisms. Modern researchers who have studied these environments found them filled with toxic mold spores, ancient bacteria, fungus growing on decayed organic matter, bat droppings that accumulated over centuries, dried chemicals from the embalming process that become airborne, and pockets of air with dangerously low oxygen levels. Scientists identified specific strains, including Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus niger, both of which are capable of causing severe respiratory infections, lung damage, and in people with weakened immune systems, potentially fatal illness. Other studies found strains of bacteria that can cause serious fever, inflammation, and long-term health problems in anyone exposed without proper protection. So yes, entering a sealed ancient tomb could absolutely make someone sick, could potentially kill someone whose health was already compromised. But not because an ancient pharaoh cursed them. Because microbiology doesn't care who you are, what your intentions are, or whether you believe in curses. The earliest archaeologists, the Victorian tomb explorers, the treasure hunters of the 1800s and early 1900s, they didn't wear protective masks. They didn't use modern ventilation equipment. They didn't understand airborne pathogens. They had no concept of spore inhalation or bacterial infection from environmental exposure. When they got sick, when they developed respiratory problems, when they suffered mysterious fevers, this was the actual reason. Not magic, not supernatural revenge, just basic biology that they didn't understand yet. If anyone involved in early Egyptian archaeology fell ill after entering a tomb, the scientific explanation is obvious and completely sufficient. No curse required. But here's the crucial point. Newspapers of that era completely ignored this explanation, deliberately and systematically. Why? Because it was too logical, too scientific, too boring. It didn't sell papers. Fear and mystery sold papers. Ancient curses sold papers. Rational explanations about mold spores? Nobody wanted to read that. So the biological truth was buried, and the supernatural legend was amplified until it drowned out reality completely. But this raises an even deeper question. Why did the idea of a curse catch on so powerfully that it completely overshadowed all scientific evidence? Why does it persist today when we have overwhelming proof it's false? The answer lies not in ancient Egypt, but in the human mind. To understand why the curse of the pharaohs became one of the world's most enduring legends, we need to understand what ancient Egypt represents in the Western imagination. For centuries, Egypt has symbolized the unknown, the spiritual realm, the afterlife, hidden knowledge, divine power, and the mysteries that lie beyond death. Humans are naturally, psychologically drawn to stories that make the world feel larger, stranger, and more magical than our everyday experience suggests. We crave mystery. We want to believe there are forces beyond scientific explanation. We're attracted to the idea that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge or power we've lost. Believing in the curse of the pharaohs makes life feel more mysterious, more meaningful. It suggests that death isn't the end, that spiritual forces are real, that there are consequences for violating sacred spaces. But there's also a deeper, more complex emotional factor at play, one that's rarely discussed openly. The curse became, in many people's minds, a story of justice. Think about the historical context. For centuries, Egyptian tombs were robbed, emptied, and pillaged. Mummies were unwrapped at Victorian parties for entertainment. Artifacts were shipped to European museums without Egyptian consent. Ancient bodies were ground up and sold as medicine. Sacred spaces were treated as curiosities for wealthy Western collectors. From a certain perspective, this was profound disrespect for the dead, for Egyptian culture, for sacred beliefs about the afterlife. So when someone involved in tomb excavation died unexpectedly, when Lord Carnarvon fell ill and passed away, Many people around the world interpreted it as poetic justice. They disturbed the dead. They violated sacred ground. Therefore, they paid the price. It became a simple, emotionally satisfying explanation for something far more complex. It transformed random tragedy into cosmic justice. Humans absolutely love moral stories. Stories where there are clear consequences for actions, where the universe operates according to fairness and balance. Even when the facts don't support these stories, we find them comforting. In this sense, we are not cursed by ancient pharaohs. We are cursed by our own need for dramatic, morally satisfying explanations. But here's something that rarely gets discussed in documentaries about the curse. Something that adds another fascinating layer to this entire story. Some Egyptians actually encouraged the curse narrative, but not for the reason most people assume. When Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in the 1920s, Egypt was in the middle of intense political struggle. The country was fighting for independence from British colonial control. Egyptian nationalism was rising. There was growing resentment about Western powers taking Egyptian treasures and displaying them in foreign museums. In this context, some Egyptian scholars and citizens embraced the curse story, not as supernatural truth, but as powerful cultural symbolism. It was a way of saying to the Western world, you can take our artifacts, you can remove our treasures, you can ship our history to your museums, but you cannot take our spiritual power. You cannot escape the consequences of disrespecting our ancestors. It was emotional protest wrapped in supernatural language, a way of asserting Egyptian dignity and cultural significance in the face of colonial exploitation. Meanwhile, British newspapers used the exact same curse story for completely different reasons. They used it to sell more copies, to create bigger headlines, to feed Western audiences insatiable fascination with exotic, mysterious stories from distant lands. Both sides had motives. Neither side had supernatural evidence. This makes the legend even more interesting, more layered, more revealing about human nature, because the curse didn't grow from ancient magic at all. It grew from modern politics, from sensational journalism, from cultural conflict, from colonial dynamics, and from the universal human tendency to create meaning through storytelling. But to truly understand this story, to see why the curse narrative is not just false, but actually obscures something more profound, we must look at what the ancient Egyptians actually believed about death, the afterlife, and their tombs. When you study ancient Egyptian religious texts, funerary inscriptions, and theological writings, a completely different picture emerges from the curse mythology. Ancient Egyptians left inscriptions that might sound mysterious or threatening to modern ears. But when you understand their actual worldview built over thousands of years of consistent religious belief, you realize their concerns were fundamentally different from what we imagine. Their entire culture was organized around several core beliefs: protecting the physical body of the dead, maintaining Ma'at, which means cosmic balance and order, preserving the Ki, the spiritual essence of a person, and ensuring safe passage into the afterlife. What they feared most was not revenge or punishment. They feared chaos, disorder, and the ultimate nightmare for an ancient Egyptian, being forgotten. For them, to exist in the afterlife, your name had to be spoken, your memory had to be preserved. The worst possible fate was not death. It was complete erasure from memory, having your name chiseled off monuments, having your existence deleted from history. When tombs occasionally did contain warnings, they were symbolic, pragmatic deterrents aimed at contemporary tomb robbers. Inscriptions that said things like, "Those who enter with impure hearts will face judgment," or "He who disturbs this place disturbs the order of Ma'at." These weren't magical death spells designed to kill archaeologists 3,000 years later. They were warnings to potential thieves, statements of sacred protection, expressions of hope that cosmic justice would prevail. The difference is crucial, and here's the most profound irony. The deepest truth that the curse legend completely obscures. For ancient Egyptians, the worst punishment imaginable was being forgotten, having their names disappear, their achievements erased, their existence reduced to nothing. But what actually happened? When the modern world became obsessed with Egyptian tombs, when millions of people studied their culture, when tourists from around the globe visited their monuments, when their names, Tutankhamun, Ramses, Cleopatra, became household words spoken across every continent, the exact opposite of the curse happened. They were remembered, eternally, globally. Their legacy became immortal in ways they could never have imagined. In this sense, the real desire of the pharaohs, to be remembered forever, to achieve immortality through memory, came true. Tutankhamun, a relatively minor pharaoh who died young and accomplished little compared to the great warrior kings of Egypt, became the most famous pharaoh in history because of his tomb's discovery. His name is spoken more today than it was in his own era. If there's any magic in this story, it's that. But the supernatural curse narrative overshadows this deeper, more beautiful truth. It reduces ancient Egyptians to vengeful spirits, to magical thinking, to primitive superstition. It obscures what they actually were. Human beings with sophisticated beliefs, complex values, rational fears, and universal hopes. Not gods. Not angry spirits waiting to strike down intruders. Not mystical forces beyond comprehension. They were people, trying to understand death, trying to preserve memory, trying to find meaning in mortality. Understanding this brings us full circle to the fundamental question we've been building toward throughout this entire investigation. If there is no curse, if the supernatural explanation is false, if the biology is understood, if the psychology is clear, what is the real mystery here? What is the actual story we should be paying attention to? After examining all the evidence, after reviewing the biology, the psychology, the politics, the journalism, and the true beliefs of ancient Egyptians, one realization becomes absolutely clear. The curse of the pharaohs is not a story about death. It's not a story about ancient magic. It's not even really a story about Egypt. It's a story about belief itself, about how humans create meaning, about how we construct reality through narrative. It demonstrates how humans create patterns where none exist, how fear spreads exponentially faster than facts, how newspapers and media can shape global legends that persist for generations, how cultural conflict and colonial dynamics create myths, how misunderstandings transform into accepted truth, and how once a story becomes popular enough, it becomes nearly impossible to erase, regardless of evidence. The curse shows us something profound about human nature. We are storytelling creatures. We create narratives to explain the world, to give meaning to random events, to impose order on chaos. And sometimes, those stories become more powerful than truth. In the end, the pharaohs didn't curse anyone. We cursed ourselves with our own imagination, with our fear, with our stories, with our desperate need to explain the unknown with something magical, dramatic, and unforgettable. We cursed ourselves with confirmation bias, with selective memory, with the psychological tendency to see what we expect to see rather than what actually exists. And perhaps that is the real power of ancient Egypt. Not a supernatural curse reaching across millennia, but a human one. A story so perfectly crafted to appeal to our deepest fears and fascinations that the world can never let it go. The tombs of Egypt do hold a curse, but not the one we've been told. The real curse is this: we are so enchanted by the legend that we ignore the far more fascinating truth. The truth that we live in a universe governed by comprehensible laws. That ancient civilizations were human, not supernatural. That death, while mysterious, follows biological rules. That history is built by people, not magic. This truth is actually more amazing than any curse could ever be, because it means we have the power to understand to discover, to know. The curse is broken not by magic, but by knowledge, by asking questions, by examining evidence, by refusing to accept comfortable myths when uncomfortable facts are available. So the next time you hear someone speak of the curse of the pharaohs, remember this: the only curse is ignorance, and the only antidote is the courage to seek truth, even when legend is more appealing. The tombs of Egypt hold treasures beyond imagination. But the greatest treasure isn't gold, it's understanding. And that treasure is available to anyone brave enough to think critically and question what they've been told. The curse, like all superstitions, dissolves in the light of reason. What remains is something far more valuable: the truth. If you found this journey into one of history's greatest myths fascinating, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into more mysteries, separating fact from fiction, and uncovering the truth behind the legends that have captivated the world. Don't miss the next investigation. Subscribe now, and let's uncover the truth together.